Hello, everybody. It's your professor here for Western Civ 1. And so this is my lecture on Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince and on the Italian Renaissance, Italy, and during the Italian period. And so that's what I want to talk about today on my recording for you. So I have titled my lecture The Return of Antiquity, Machiavelli, and Medieval Italy, 1300 or so to 1530. And what we're going to talk about today is the background to his life and the work, The Prince, which you probably have heard of, one of the founding texts of modern Western political philosophy. So we'll get into this here real quick. A few key terms: Machiavelli, the Medici family of Florence, Studia Humanitatis, which is the humanist program of learning, which we'll talk about in a second. Single point perspective, Guelphs and Ghibellines, civic humanism. So I'll come to all those in a moment. Now, finally, you have this is the last section of the course we're going through here, the last two texts, as I organize it this week with Renaissance and Machiavelli, next week with the Reformation. And so the last section I called Midwifing the Modern. We're talking about women here in this course. And we generally understand, historians have for a long time, the Renaissance and Reformation events to be a break with the medieval past, which they are in the long run, although they do this by appealing to antiquity against the recent past. Both Renaissance and Reformation are born out of critiques of contemporary society, but they look backward. And in fact, one of the things we'll talk about here with Machiavelli is you can see him as a forward-looking thinker who looks forward to, our day, modern secular politics, but also someone who looks backwards. And a lot of the progressive aspects of these movements are kind of unintended. Most people didn't think they were breaking new ground when they did the things they did. So let's talk about the Italian Renaissance. When we talk about Renaissance, we talk about, antiquity, the return of antiquity, because if you know anything about the Italian Renaissance, of course, you must know it's associated with the return of classical thought, architecture, painting, those sorts of things. In this course, however, you've known already that antiquity as a sort of object of study or veneration never left Western Europe. So how do we get the idea that this is the Renaissance, the return of antiquity, right? That comes from 19th century historians. When the modern academic history profession was starting in the 19th century, you had historians in France, people like Jules Michelet, or the Swiss German historian Jakob Burckhardt. They took Italy and late medieval Italy as a starting point for what they thought of as modernity. Remember, this is the 19th century. You have modern secular republics being born through revolution in these countries. They're looking back to find the origin points for all this. And they latch on to the Renaissance, particularly Burckhardt, his book, The Civilization of Renaissance in Italy, classic work, identifies the emergence of the individual, of the state as a self-conscious creation in the in late medieval Italy. And so you have all this stuff going on, which they want to see as the origins for their own day. And so that's where you get this sort of look back to our own day. And of course, one of the things that's different about this return of antiquity, this sort of movement based on it in this period, that is slightly different from what preceded it. If you remember back to Aquinas with Aristotle, with Duoda, who also knows classical antiquity, Latin classical antiquity fairly well. All this learning is in the service of theology, of the church, religious ends. What's going to be different with the Renaissance of the late Middle Ages, North and South, by the way, is a valuation of antiquity for its own sake that is widespread. You have some people earlier than this who can appreciate that, but most people see it as a means to an end. Here you're going to have a group of thinkers which self-consciously not only values antiquity for its own sake, but pits it against, again, contemporary society. It's critiquing contemporary society on the basis of antiquity. And as I mentioned before, we tend to see this period as one of great, leap forward and all this stuff. certainly the great art of the period make us think that. But modern historians are not so sure. Um, a lot of modern historians have taken the view that the Renaissance was actually in some ways a regressive movement. I talked about Johann Huizen last week with his book, the Autumn of the Middle Ages, where you had this very, unrealistic nostalgia for the ancient world among a lot of thinkers in Northern and Southern Europe. These late medieval courts. Machiavelli, as you'll see, thinks of ancient authors, classical authors, as his friends. He uses that term. There's a very backward-looking ideal to all this, which is kind of strange when you think about it. In other ways, you could see the Renaissance movement as being kind of decadent, as a retarding progress in things like, for example, science. Lynn Thorndike was a historian, had a thesis that it saw a slowing of scientific endeavor. Why is this? Because one of the things that humanist thinkers of the Renaissance emphasized to a great degree was language. And so they turned away from the rigorous, logical philosophy of the scholastics to look at language, which had its own uses and everything. But it means they're obsessed with language in kind of a quasi-magical way. There's an obsession with, as I'll show you in a moment, finding the origins of human language. Partly, by the way, because they begin to see magic as language as the key to understanding things, but also controlling things like nature. They're very much into magical, as I'll get this in a second, some of these humanists, not Machiavelli. Of course, one of the other things that you have in this period, of course, is economic decline. The late medieval period, early 15th, 16th century sees the appearance of inflation in Europe. And you have a money economy really for the first time in a long time, which nobody understands. So there's a big economic crisis going on in Europe at this point. It's not necessarily the most wonderful thing in the world. And then finally, I think we associate most with the Renaissance maybe as art. And you do have a greater naturalism of the human form being depicted by artists. You have this use of single point perspective. Single point perspectives means depicting human figures as they are in 3 dimensions, rather than flat 2-dimensional depiction, from the standpoint of a single observer, hence single point perspective, which there's a greater interest in individual human beings. The use of portrait painting becomes popular in the Italian Renaissance for the first time. So there is that there, but is this realistic? And I mention this because it's kind of something that Machiavelli actually will pick up on, this idea of single point perspective in the Prince a little bit by comparison. So just to show you what I mean by this, and so my point is it's not all totally a simple progressive narrative, I guess you want to put it that way. Let me show you the art for a second to make my point. This is a book illustration from the 14th century in England, and it's a traditional subject. This is the Annunciation of the angel Gabriel to the Virgin Mary, announcing she'll, bear Jesus in the womb. This comes from the Gospels. Traditionally, traditional subject, traditional depiction. Angel, the little, blurb there, Ave Maria, gratia plena. And then a flat 2-dimensional depiction, almost iconic. That's what icons are. They're meant to be flat and static. They're meant to depict people not as they are in nature, but as they are supposed to be, saints, and their saints has a little halo there, as they will be in heaven, obviously. This next painting is from the Venetian painter Sandro Botticelli. I don't remember, it's in the 15th century, I don't remember the date. Same subject, look at how different, right? Everything's geometric, everything's done with these geometric lines. There's proportion to everything. She has this almost dance-like move where he's reaching out and saying no, and she's going like this, and she's demure and eyes downcast. It's an amazing painting, right? I've actually seen the original, by the way. It's in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Beautiful, and just to give you an idea just how visually stunning this stuff is. Look at her shawl. If you don't look at it really closely, you can tell it's actually somehow looks translucent. I think he painted a translucent shawl somehow. I didn't know I did that, but it's amazing. but it's also much more, as you can see, naturalistic. Maybe not too naturalistic. I mean, I wouldn't say realistic because they're almost too perfect, right? But it is in 3 dimensions. It looks like a physical human being as they exist, more or less. Also, his part of his shawl is translucent. I mentioned it, so wonderful painting. So it looks like progress, right? It definitely is in some ways. Well, take a look at this. I mentioned that the humanists were into magic. What this is, you can't read that thing at the bottom in Latin. This is a mosaic from the Cathedral of Siena, 1488. But I actually had the date right here. Botticelli's Annunciation was 1489. This is 1488. And it's a mosaic of a figure known as Hermes Trismegistus. What is that? Who is that? Well, back in late antiquity, around 300 or so AD, a corpus of Platonic texts, Platonic philosophy, came down to Western Europe, which Western Europeans didn't know where it came from. They thought it was much older. And this body of text was supposed to contain wisdom about nature. And it was identified with a person named Hermes Trismegistus. And contemporaries in the Renaissance thought that this figure of Hermes Trismegistus was, among other things, perhaps a contemporary of Moses in the Bible. And the idea was you would use the secret knowledge of nature to control nature. The idea that you're using, for example, language to, magically manipulate things was very tempting to a lot of these Renaissance thinkers. They were looking, by the way, they had all sorts of obsessions, one of which was finding the original human language, right? Some people thought it was Hebrew. That's why Hebrew comes back into popularity in the Renaissance in terms of learning languages. But also because they thought language gave you control. And they're very much about that, the humanists. And particularly Neoplatonism, that Platonic philosophy, is very prominent at the Medici court in Florence. And so, again, this is, that sort of progress regress thing. You're looking back to this. And by the way, obviously he's not a real person. He's a made-up figure. They don't know that. Toward the end of the 17th century, they figure out, he's not a real person anymore. But they thought he was. And so it gives you an idea. It's on the actual floor of a cathedral. So this is bound up with a lot of things, culturally speaking, in late medieval Europe, and Italy specifically. So humanism is a multicolored sort of coat, if you want to put it that way. So what is humanism? To turn to that, the so-called new learning, Renaissance humanism. Why is it new? One of the things that's new about it is that it focuses really, really heavily on language, on text, on rhetoric. Its new program of learning is you could almost say it is formulated in rejection of scholastic ideals of how you learn. Remember, in scholasticism in university, you'd have the 7 liberal arts, so-called. You go through that, the quadrivium and the trivium. Quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music. The trivium is grammar, rhetoric, logic. Well, in this program of learning, sometimes called the Studia Humanitatis, they skipped over some of that stuff. Instead, grammar, rhetoric, they keep those. But poetry, history / history of politics normally, moral philosophy, form the basis for a humanist education. And their study of program differed in other ways. One of which is that if you see in Aquinas, he talks about commentaries on Aristotle, commentaries on the script, all this stuff. They get rid of that in humanism. They go back to the original texts, ad fontes in Latin, to the sources. That's their big rallying cry. Skip Aquinas, go to Aristotle. Skip whatever Arabic commentator, go back to the Greeks. That's their ideal in many ways. So very different, as is, of course, their emphasis on rhetoric and language over logic. You need to have the persuasive power of language in order to get your way, rather than sort of dusty, dry, mere logic. In practice, this also meant the promotion of classical languages. I mentioned Latin, of course, has never left. I mentioned Hebrew. They start studying all sorts of different languages. One of the reasons for this, by the way, is they get an unexpected boost in terms of the Greek language. It comes back into Western Europe in 1453 or after 1453, when the Byzantine Empire, which we left with poor Lexa Comnena, and her family, it gets conquered by the Ottoman Empire in 1453. And so a bunch of Greek-speaking scholars flee to Italy. And for the first time in the academies of the Renaissance, you have people teaching Greek again in the Western world for the first time in a long time. Same time I mentioned you have other languages being taught: Hebrew, Syriac, other things. Again, trying to get back to the original tongues of the Bible. You have, great libraries being forged. For example, one of these is at the Vatican, by the way. The Vatican Library is based on the donation of Pope Nicholas V, dies in 1455. His 9,000 volumes form the basis of the Vatican Library. And people are dedicated to this stuff. And one of the things they're dedicated to, by the way, is the critical examination of ancient texts. One of the most famous of these critical examinations, by the way, was that of Lorenzo Valla, who was a humanist who discovered that something called the donation of Constantine was a forgery. If you don't know what this is, the papacy, medieval papacy, had a state, had secular domains in central Italy, which on the basis of a document was supposed to go back to Constantine, was supposed to have been given to them by the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. Well, Lorenzo Valla was a humanist, compared the text of this donation of Constantine, so-called, with text from the time of Constantine, and noticed that Latin didn't match up, had different spelling, stuff like this. And by comparing it to those at a much later date, came to figure out it was a forgery. It was made up basically by somebody in the Roman Curia in the 9th century to bolster papal claims to govern the papal states. And the kicker here, by the way, is Lorenzo Valla was a papal secretary. So you shouldn't think, by the way, this is an irreligious, anti-religious exercise, humanism. It, for the most part, was not. Maybe a few people could be that way. But it's coming out of this stuff. It's actually, a pope like Leo X, who's a sort of Reformation pope, doesn't have a great reputation, was an avid reader of classical texts. He actually used the printing press to distribute copies of classical and other religious texts to his friends. And so this goes hand in hand with this critical examination, not just of things like the donation of Constantine, but also the Vulgate. The Vulgate is the Latin edition of the Bible that comes down from Antiquity, from St. Jerome, the early church father, which the medieval Catholic Church took as the official translation of its of that text. You have someone like Desiderius Erasmus, we'll talk a little bit about next week in the Reformation, next time in the Reformation, where he compared it with earlier Greek texts and found it wanting in certain ways. So you have this again, criticism based on antiquity against current, authorities, and so they're drawing not only, drawing on this stuff, not only for these criticisms, by the way, but also for new texts, just because of, the fleeing of Greek scholars into Western Europe. You're having ancient texts that have not been present in Western Europe for many, many centuries, almost a millennia. Things like, for example, the poetry of Lucretius. Lucretius is an atomist thinker, philosopher. His long poem, De Rerum Natura, comes back into the 15th century in Europe, and is the cause of the revival of the philosophy of Epicureanism in 15th century Europe. Which will have, by the way, proved crucial to the development of the natural sciences in the long run. But still, it comes in through the Renaissance. Another thing that emerges in this is what's sometimes called civic humanism. This is one of those new ideas. They're revived ideas. And this is the ideal of essentially republicanism, for loyalty to a city-state rather than to a king or a feudal nobleman. And it's opposed to that sort of ideal of service. It can be to a prince or to a republic, but it's an opposition to feudal ideals of loyalty in favor of classical ones, especially from writers like Cicero, whose texts were known as far back as the Carolingians, but you have this being a matter of emphasis and enthusiasm, the emphasis on being an active member of the state, being a citizen, right? A citizen is someone who takes an active role in public affairs. If you remember way back to Antiquity and the classical idea of the city-state there, where the people, the citizenry of Athens did everything in the state. That's what they're kind of trying to resurrect here, and not on being a mere passive subject of your monarch, in other words. And can't stress how crucial this is, though, by the way, for political life. Florentine writers, not just like Machiavelli, but I think it's Guicciardini is the other guys. There's several of them who take up this theme of republicanism, who will be read by 17th century English Republican authors, who will in turn be read by the founders of the American Republic. They know their Machiavelli, they know some of these late medieval thinkers very well. Another thing that they take from these texts, this critical examination does, is it's the first in a long series of steps, a longer process, by which something like a modern historical perspective emerges. And what I mean by that is you begin to have the idea that, our modern idea is that you can have the same society change drastically over time, right? It'd be the same society, but it'll have like major breaks within it. The medievals, not to see that. They tended to think of all societies being the same, essentially, or societies being static and not changing really over time in any meaningful ways. And what's ironic about this is that none of these humanists in the 15th century really had a modern notion of history. What they did was they resurrected older classical notions of history, of cyclical views, of history repeating itself, a la Plutarch. If you've ever read Plutarch, his parallel lives, he parallels the lives of famous Greek and Latin historical figures with the idea that basically these are just types that repeat themselves throughout history. They have no idea yet of a unique individual in that sense. And so because they're reading all these texts, they take that idea from them. But because they are also dazzled by, especially in Italy, of course, Italy, they have the ruins everywhere of the old Roman Empire. So they live around this stuff in a lot of ways. It makes them see the past as superior to their own day. Kind of ironic, isn't it? That what we think of the Italian Renaissance being this awesome era, they thought everything sucked. Not totally. The whole idea, by the way, of the Middle Ages being a dark age comes from this period. It actually comes from the writer, the poet, Petrarch. He was the first one to popularize the idea that Europe had fallen into a dark age following the collapse of Rome. But he was referring to his own time period. Again, very, very interesting that comes out because of this. And again, this is the first step on the path of beginning to see the past as being unique and unrepeatable, like we kind of do here. In the long run, because they do see antiquity as something different from their own day. And then finally, one of the things that comes out of all these classical texts, you can go back to like the great epics we've read, the Odyssey and the Aeneid. Humanists will put a lot of emphasis on what Jakob Burckhardt calls, quote, a modern form of glory, unquote, meaning a positive appraisal of individual human achievement. There's you have that notion going back to the ancient Greeks, right, where they had the ancient Olympics and they basically had only individual events. There were no team events. That ideal is very much there. That appreciation of what human beings can accomplish. This is where you get from humanist writers who are drawing on Cicero and other ancient thinkers, writing books of manuals for humanist etiquette, right? The most famous of these is by a man named Baldassare Castiglione, who wrote a book called The Book of the Courtier in 1528, which was a dialogue about what the perfect courtier at a court should be like. And this is very different. You couldn't be any different from a medieval courtier who basically knew how to hunt and fight in war. Now, his ideal was someone who could do, first of all, do all things with sprezzatura, which means nonchalance, but literally do everything else well. Be a great knight, be a great warrior, but also be learned, have good manners, have etiquette, have charm. You could sing, dance, write poetry, speak several languages because it was gifted, be a soldier, and do it all with like real aplomb and cool, like it's no big deal. That's the ideal you're talking about when you say a Renaissance man, if you want to put it in those terms. And then just in general, of course, this involves a more positive view of what human beings are like than the mainstream of medieval, say, medieval theology, right? Which put emphasis on sinfulness and the need for God. And by the way, most of these people still believe that they're sinful and they need God, but there is an acknowledgement of individual human achievement, which is simply a little bit different in emphasis. And you can see this clearly in art and architecture and things of that nature. Which brings us, of course, finally to the history itself. We have to talk about the Italian city-states here. The Italian polis. And I'm making that comparison explicit. You can remember far back enough to go back to Antiquity and classical Greece, how you had all these city-states competing with each other in ancient Greece, and that's what sort of led to all that sort of cultural flourishing in Athens and elsewhere. A similar thing's going to take place in late medieval Italy, because you will still have cities there, even after the fall of the empire, even if they're tiny little towns at first. They will grow to become something like bigger towns in the latter part of the Middle Ages. And this is one of the central facts, actually, of Italian life in this period, is severe disunity and strife between these city-states. Florence, Milan, Pisa, Venice, other places. You're going to have them competing with each other both militarily, politically, and culturally, like you did in ancient Athens. Even though they shared a cultural identity, they understood they were part of an Italian peninsula, which went back to ancient Rome. Kind of like, again, the Greeks had a culture that went back to Homer, right? So it's similar in that regard. But it's also full of conflict because these city-states, by the time they emerge into their historical record in the 12th century, they're going to have, there are going to be three types, basically, of cities. Going to be great commercial cities, port cities like Genoa and Venice on the coasts, dominated by the mercantile elite. Going to be large-scale industrial centers like Milan and Florence in the north. I'll show you a map in a second, where the sort of entrepreneurial elite dominate, and then others that serve as local market centers throughout the peninsula. And most of they have similar governing structures by the time we get to 1400, or at least the beginning of the 1300s. Offices will rotate among citizen elites. Judicial function will be assigned to people from outside the city, called podestas. There'll be both large and small councils established in order to seek advice and establish consensus, etc. And so you have something like self-government in these medieval republics, and there are republics. The social conflict that mostly takes place within this elite classes. They're not exactly nobility. It's not the equivalent of feudal nobility at all. Most of these people, these great families in these cities, begin in their ancestry as landowners in the city. Over time, they come to be bound up with all the other mercantile and other interests in the city. And in fact, they're called grandi. That's what Machiavelli calls the two classes, basically, in Florence. Grandi, sort of like elites, and popolo, people, everybody else. And so you're going to have conflict between those two groups, but mostly conflict within these sort of oligarchies that'll come to run these cities, these mercantile oligarchies. That conflict in turn fuels conflict between the city-states. And again, the parallels are direct in some ways with the Greeks. You're going to have lots of warfare, especially you get to the later period. Florence, by the way, will establish its own empire effectively in northern Italy, conquers a couple of other city-states. You'll have them increasingly over time begin to actually take over places and establish territorial empires of their own. And one of the things they do, by the way, which parallels ancient Greece, is the use of mercenaries in warfare. Condottieri, what they call them, throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, and this will have a big effect on the country, on the peninsula itself as well. Which I should mention, by the way, in terms of Florence, the main the city that Machiavelli is from is associated with. They develop early on a republican ideology of empire. One, by the way, is explicitly Christian. This is a Christian empire, all this other stuff. It's very interesting to see. Very interesting to see, by the way, the language they use. If you get a chance to read about it, and how they justify what they're doing. Another source of conflict, by the way, in division is older conflicts. This is before Machiavelli's time, actually, but in the it comes to its high point in the 13th century. But this is conflict driven by the conflict between the papacy and the emperors, the Holy Roman Empire, because in Italy, basically, cities will come to be divided along those lines. Cities who support, or factions within cities who support the papacy, called Guelphs, or those who support the emperors, were called Ghibellines. Dante, if you don't know, was a Guelph early in his life. He becomes a supporter of the empire when he goes into exile, but there was a conflict within Florence during his lifetime in the 13th century over this very problem. And then finally, you have the rise of lo Stato, the state, by 1400. And what I mean by state is something like what we mean by state. Because you're going to have a lot of these cities by 1400 basically giving individuals power, usually for a limited period, but it becomes more and more a thing that can become hereditary. And the figures are usually called signori, which again kind of grows up alongside these republican institutions, and where you're going to have some of these signores just wind up taking over the cities. And so they'll become increasingly, my point, these republican institutions will go from being real republics to oligarchies, to by the very end of this period, actually, maybe a little outside of it, almost all of them be under the control of the prince. So there's this decline from earlier liberty to one-man rule. And so yeah, so you're going to have this state growing as a result of all this conflict and drive for power. And the most famous of these, of course, is Florence, which from the early period had representative institutions. However, to the moment, by the 15th century, it's dominated by one family. And Florence made its mark by becoming the great banking center of not just Italy, but all of Europe by the 13th century. Its coinage, the florins, the coin that used there, became the major currency throughout Europe. It was so secure and recognized. And so yeah, so you have this ideal growing in Florence. It's one of the things Machiavelli will talk about. He's at the end of its Republican period, and the beginning of its decline in that regard. And just here's the map of what more or less in the 15th century and the 15th century would have liked in Machiavelli's day. And you can see it's kind of a patchwork of states. The Kingdom of Naples we'll come back to in a moment. It's one of the bigger ones. It's in the southern part of Italy, the Kingdom of Sicily. You have the Genoa Republic up here, Florence, Siena, Venice. Those are the only ones left basically by the end of the Middle Ages. You can see the great duchies there: Savoy, Milan, Ferrara, Modena, and of course the Papal States, which is their papacy in the center of the peninsula. Actually, a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of other patchwork states here. But this is what it would have looked like what he's talking about when he refers to stuff. You can refer back to that map. There's also a map in your textbook, though. So now we come finally to the age of Machiavelli and the rise of Florence in his day. I mentioned you're going to have this. You're going to have a rise to power of a single family, the Medici family, in the 1420s. And what happens basically is in the 1430s, 1434, if you want to date it exactly, the Medici family, Giovanni Medici, Cosimo de' Medici, basically comes to rule Florence, but not actually hold office. They sort of pull the strings behind the state. How did they do this? Well, what happens is by the time you get to the early 15th century, a lot of, and the Medici, by the way, were a banking family. They're bankers. So that's the first thing. They have money. But they, what happens is many people in Florence start to go into debt, and they get sent into prison. early part of the 15th century. And what Cosimo does is go around buying up these people's debts and getting them out of prison. Why? So he can get them into office and they can do his bidding for him. Otherwise, he'll just send them back to prison. And this is essentially how the Medici will rule up through the end of the 15th century. Behind the scenes, more and more declared and pronounced as you get toward the end of the 15th century. But this is effectively how they govern the city. And people are aware of this, by the way, after a while. They know this is going on. However, by the end of the 15th century, when you have, as you see in a moment, an invasion by the French, this leads to an uprising against his grandson, Piero, Cosimo's grandson. When the Florentines kick him out of the city, and they reestablish real Republican institutions, or make them really Republican again, after they've been dominated by the money of the Medici. And they were actually led in 1494 by a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola, who was one of the great preachers of the age, a severe critic, both of the moral failings of the Florentines, and they had them galore, trust me, but also the papacy, which had them galore, trust me, at that time. And he was also a magnetic personality. He made friends with, by the way, Lorenzo the Magnificent, Lorenzo de' Medici, Cosimo's son. Lorenzo de' Medici is the great patron, by the way, of Michelangelo, people like that. He became essentially his spiritual guide till the end of his life, if you can imagine, this hellfire breathing preacher. But when the French threatened the city, he had been predicting that God would send an army as punishment to punish them for their sin. And he becomes the power behind the Republic for the next several years. However, he doesn't actually rule like Cosimo. What he does basically is they kick the Medici out, and effectively they reestablish what is about as close to a real democracy as you can get in the 15th century. Every single free male is essentially enfranchised. And yet at the same time, he exercises an outsized influence on this city, establishes informally a kind of theocratic republic. It's hard to explain. He began trying to purge the Florentines of their excesses. I won't go into this too much detail, but he made bonfires he encouraged them to give up their vanities. Right? This is bonfire of the vanities, to give up their art, their jewelry, all their veneries, and burn them in the middle. He did this several times. Burn these things in a fire in the middle of the Campo de' Fiori, the Campanella in the middle of the city. As you can kind of tell, after a while, the Florentines got sick of this, as did the papacy, who was tired of him. Eventually, his critics managed to sort of surround the convent where he lived. They actually laid siege to it. He and several of his confreres were eventually condemned as heretics and burned at the stake in 1498. However, the Republic went on until 1512, which, by the way, this is actually the period after 1498. Machiavelli will come into the historical record. He'll be an official in the Republic after the fall of Savonarola. And finally, what happens is in 1527, there's another invasion. The Florentines get rid of the Medici again. It's briefly a republic. What happens is, as you'll see in a moment, another power, the empire, comes in, sacks Rome, takes over Florence, and puts the Medici back in power, this time officially, more or less, as dukes of Florence. It becomes a princedom. They lose their liberty, never to regain it, by the way. At the same time, Machiavelli will refer to some of this history I've just talked about here in the book, that's why I'm going over it in such detail. They'll have major rivals, and I'll mention three. The Venetian Republic, ancient republic on the Mediterranean Sea, became really wealthy through trade, for long-distance trade to the Middle East in the Middle Ages. By the 14th century, it had acquired a small maritime empire, and kind of reaches its height in the 15th century, begins to decline in the 16th and 17th centuries. Was originally ruled by a doge, sort of like a duke, but slowly over time came to be ruled by a very small ruling council, an oligarchy, a mercantile oligarchy, even though they thought of themselves as being a classical republic. That's in the northwest of Italy. The Dukes of Milan in the north was only established in 1395, but it's one of these things where you have this signor, this hereditary dukedom emerging. And in particular, an adventurer named Francesco Sforza, whom again Machiavelli will mention in the text, seized Milan in 1450 and made himself duke. As you're going to see, it'll pass hands, it'll be conquered to a certain degree in some of the wars I'm going to talk about, but it's also a major player in the Italian peninsula. And then finally, the Papal States. The papacy ruled that large territory around Rome and central Italy. It had, of course, advantages, as Machiavelli will mention in the text, but it has, being a religious and political entity, I mean, but it has all the same problems that secular rulers have. It's plagued by internal factions, the need for revenues, the need for money for both for defense. I mean, it is attacked, by the way, I'll say that. But it's also, it's a very wealthy, you know, papacy is wealthy because of papal taxes and church taxes. It also, by the way, has had, I mentioned those problems with internal fighting. I'll mention this a little more next week, but the papacy actually left Italy for most of the 1300s, left and went to Avignon in France to get away from nobility in Rome, who were, you know, fighting over, trying to control the papacy and everything. And so it's got a lot of, you know, it's got a lot of rivals for the papal thrones, trying to subjugate. And late medieval popes, not the best. Especially the Borgia popes, obviously. I won't have time to go into that. But one of these popes will actually be, most of the popes don't do this. They hire armies, mercenary armies. One of them, Julius II, whom he'll mention in here, will actually lead papal armies into battle, try to subjugate their rivals in the Italian peninsula. So you have major conflicts here, which he'll mention. Don't worry about that. But what really is exercising besides this, Machiavelli and his work, are a series of invasions by big powers in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century. The first of these is the French, 1494. By the 1490s, by the way, France has reached more or less its modern state in terms of its size. It's the biggest kingdom in Europe, powerful, has lots of money, has a big army. They invade in 1494, the first Dutch and French invasion. There's actually three of them. First, Charles VIII will unite with Milan against Venice, try to carve up northern Italy. Second time in 1499. Louis XII will do this again. He managed to take Milan and the Kingdom of Naples, but had to divide it with the King of Spain, who was his partner. And then finally, again, in 1508, you have them going back in there. The Pope tries to get a league against Venice, but then against the French, who ally together again. But it's too late. France, under Francis I, wins a great victory at 1515 at Marignano. The league against him collapses, and basically France and Venice control the entirety of northern Italy, briefly. Because in 1521, there's another invasion. Why? Because I think I mentioned before in here the Holy Roman Empire, which is that elective monarchy, which any prince can be eligible for. One of the princes that's eligible for it is Francis I of France. He loses to a 20-year-old, 19-year-old, I think, 19 or 21-year-old kid named Charles I, Charles Habsburg of Spain. And this led to a collapse of relations between the empire and France. And so they used the pretext of a Spanish invasion of Navarre, which is a kingdom bordering France, Spanish invasion of Navarre to the French, to invade again Italy in 1521. And they try to drive Charles out of his Habsburg lands in Naples. The French are outmatched by the Spanish. They have the best troops in Europe. Francis I tries to save Milan from being conquered. Not only does he lose, he gets defeated, he gets captured at the Battle of Pavia, taken back to Madrid. He has to pay a king's ransom and make extensive concessions to Charles, which he mops up with a few years in 1526. Again, the popes are again alarmed about the empire, another power coming to Italy, so they form another league with Venice, but also the Republic of Florence, which is thrown off the Medici. And they try to keep them out. Does it work? Venice refuses to contribute troops to this. The French withdraw, so it basically leaves all of northern Italy before Charles V's armies. He subdues Florence in late 1520s, sacks Rome really brutally to his troops in 1527, where Clement VII, the Pope, is imprisoned, which I mentioned, by the way, because that'll play into the Reformation, because Charles V's aunt is actually the Queen of England, who is sterile and can't have a child, and so Henry VIII wants to divorce her. That'll play into that. And so Clement can't grant Henry VIII the annulment he wants, and that'll cause that stuff there. But it effectively means that Charles becomes master of Italy, the League collapses, and Florence is again placed under the Medici, and its Republican period comes to an end. Machiavelli, by the way, as you'll see, dies before this happens, thankfully, because he would have hated it. So we come finally to our author here today, Niccolo Machiavelli. His famous phrase, which he does actually write in here, by the way, which he's in the context of saying, by the way, if you have to choose one, it's better to be feared than to be loved. According to Machiavelli, you can't trust people's love, it's too fickle, but you can count on people acting out of fear. And this is one of the things, of course, that sums up his why he's taken with being one of the first modern thinkers. He is not sentimental at all about politics, as you shall see. So who is Machiavelli? Well, first of all, let's talk about this. You see, born in 1469. Again, mentioning he becomes into the record of Florence in 1498, after the fall of Savonarola, as an official. He's an official with the Florentine state. He oversees the militia of Florence, their citizen army, which, by the way, he's very proud of. He thinks he's actually been a good organizer. And by the way, he's just an organizer. Like, he's responsible for munitions, supplies, stuff like this. He also went on embassies to other places around the Italian peninsula, also to France. And so he's a professional. I'm gonna say bureaucrat or something. He's an actual politician in that sense. He definitely sees himself as a professional who knows what he's talking about. He'll definitely portray himself as that in The Prince, as you'll see. However, in 1512, he basically is arrested. Why? Because the Medici come back into power. Lorenzo de' Medici, grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, comes into power. He's arrested. He's tortured over a period of several days. By the way, torture is legal in Italy, many places around Europe at this point, for the purposes of interrogation. So what they would do, and your introduction describes this very well, they would do something called the strappato. They would actually tie your hands behind your back, throw a rope over you, and then suspend you from the ceiling via a pulley, like a little pulley. And they would pull you up, and then to get you to talk, and they actually had like standards by which they couldn't drop you too far or too hard. They didn't want to like harm you, but they would actually drop you down, and it would jerk your hands up like this, and it was really excruciatingly painful. And they did this to him for like over a period of 3 days, by the way. They were trying to, but they were arrested him for charges of conspiracy against the Medici, and apparently he didn't say a word. And this is something that evidently he was very proud of. He didn't break. A lot of people did break, by the way, under this. So there's that. And so he's sent into exile outside of Florence for the next 15 years, basically until the end of his life. Very end of it, basically. And that is where he will write most of the works that we were familiar with. You're not going to be reading, by the way, he wrote works of drama. He wrote plays, stuff like this. But he's most famous for his reflections on political life, which, as you see, are dedicated to discussing things of state via this humanistic, lens of antiquity. One thing also to note about this, by the way, is the problem of audience in this text, because the book, as you're going to see, is dedicated to Cosimo de' Medici. Now, the thinking had been traditionally is that he was trying to butter himself up with Cosimo de' Medici. He was the ruler of Florence after he got kicked out. We think, by the way, The Prince was written so much time between 1515 and 1515. The last parts of it finished much later, 1515, maybe a little later. And it's dedicated to Cosimo. But this raises problems because the Medici basically, in his eyes, in his other writings, qualifies as a tyrant. Remember, Machiavelli is a Republican. He favors a Republican form of government. He likes self-government. He doesn't like princes that much. So why is he dedicating this to Cosimo de' Medici? I won't go into too much detail. It's one thing you should think about for when we discuss this when we come back. Who is he writing this for? Because it doesn't seem like, by the way, somebody's been arrested for conspiring against you. You really want to hire them back. Because this is in some ways kind of like a job application, but a lot more slick, as we'll get to in a moment. But it is, your editor, by the way, has a very slick, translator has a very slick idea of what it actually is, who it's actually addressed to. I don't know if I buy it, but I'm skeptical it's actually for Cosimo. I don't even know. Yeah, it's very strange. It's a strange thing. So keep that in mind. So what does the prince deal with? Well, two things to mention about this, by the way, is it's effectively, because he's writing to, it's ostensibly to Cosimo, or was it not Cosimo, Lorenzo de' Medici. That's wrong on the outline there. Sorry about that. I'll change it for when I record this. But it's about different types of principalities. So it's not about republics. And particularly, it's talking about in some of the chapters in here how you rule a principality that you've just come into possession of. Other words, that you're new to this, to this principality. You're just taking it over. You need to rule it. How do you rule without getting killed? Basically, in the context of 15th century Italy. What you should do to acquire them, what you should do to make sure you can keep them once you get them, what kind of skills are necessary for a prince to have, what he should do, how, all the things you could think of. There's also some more specific stuff. There's a lot of just reflection on, okay, what a guy's supposed to do. And he'll talk about this, by the way, in very, well, first of all, he'll make appeals to antiquity. You'll see this throughout the book. A lot of his sources are classical works. He also appeals, by the way, if you go to the very beginning, his letter to Lorenzo de' Medici, he'll talk about perspective, well, he will talk about it in artistic terms, but if you remember single point perspective, it's from the perspective of the viewer. In other words, the subjective perspective, right? And so he'll talk about how, this is the paragraph, I'll read this for you. He says, I hope it will not be thought presumptuous for someone of humble and lowly status to dare to discuss the behavior of rulers and to make recommendations regarding policy. And here's the key passage. Just as those who paint landscapes set up their easels down in the valley to portray the nature of the mountains and the peaks and climb up to the mountain in order to draw the valleys, similarly, in order to properly understand the behavior of the lower classes, one needs to be a ruler, and in order to properly understand the behavior of rulers, one needs to be a member of the lower classes. Now, two things are worth pointing out here. This is his dedication to the Medici. One, he has been both, right? He's been in exile. He's also been in power in the state. The second thing is he's referring to something like, again, single point perspective, painting, and taking what is essentially a subjective view of politics, right? Perspective, not, the parallel for us is Aquinas, right? The king should rule in his government as God rules in the universe. You won't get any of that in this book at all. He ignores that almost entirely. And so he's talking about how to rule a new state. And this is where he brings in probably two key concepts, virtue and fortuna. And virtue is and your translators translates this into English for you from the Italian, give you the Italian word. Virtue does not mean what virtue meant for Aristotle or for Cicero or for Aquinas or for medievals, generally speaking. Virtue for those thinkers coming into that tradition of Aristotle and Plato and all that stuff mean a habit that leads you to achieve some sort of excellence, usually in moral terms, right? It's a habitual practice of qualities that make you a good person. He doesn't mean this at all. He means by virtue something that is skill. That's actually one of the older meanings, but he isolates that. Virtue is a skill that leads a prince or a ruler to getting power and maintaining it. You can't get power without skill. You can't maintain it. And one of the things you're supposed to fight against if you were a skillful ruler, and this is very very much a return of pagan ideology in his work, is fortuna, fortune or chance. Um, good rulers will try to anticipate things that they can't control, try to get around them. Because in his mind especially, again, Machiavelli is influenced by ancient historians. They tend to see the world as going in cycles. For Machiavelli, he sees that there are only certain times that are advantageous to have a republic. And when you get a chance to have one, or you get a chance to have a good government, you have to seize it. And so his ideal basically is someone who's very, very skillful and who can make use of whatever circumstances he's in to not just gain power, but also gain stability for his state he rules. This is something we can talk about in the class. He does want, biggest thing is he's trying to, when you consider what he says here, because he does say, by the way, that there are certain moments a ruler has to be skillful in basically being cruel, basically doing bad things, not because you want to do bad things, because if you do too many bad things, people will hate you and rise up and throw you out, but because you'll need to do them to secure your power. If you don't have that security, you'll just get killed somewhere down the line, or you'll get taken over somewhere down the line. That's where he actually has a passage in here when he talks about the difference between cruelty well used and cruelty abused. A good ruler will use cruelty in order to make sure he doesn't have to do it again. In fact, he actually said at one point, whenever you take over a new state, you should do all the awful things you have to do first, so you don't have to keep doing them. Because you do that, if you do it all at once, people will forget about it eventually. But if you keep doing it, they will turn on you. And so he is basically taking the position of what he claims he's a realist. This is a phrase from the book. He doesn't want to talk about ideal republics or ideal governments. People do that all the time in the Middle Ages, right? Plato, they know Plato. Aquinas's view of kingship is essentially idealistic. No, he wants to talk about, quote unquote, how things are in real life. And I say this because this goes back in some ways to, okay, who is this for? Because he's basically openly advocating things like, yes, murder when it suits a prince to do so. And it makes you, and I say this, by the way, this was never actually published in his lifetime, although it did circulate among friends. And he did try to get this to Lorenzo de' Medici, right? He was actually trying to do this. Is he meant to be taken, is he being serious when he says this? Because there's some debate. Because there's some people thinking, well, this is so brazen, this is so morally, beyond the bounds of morality. He has to be just sort of doing this as perhaps a joke maybe. Other people have suggested, by the way, that he's actually doing this hoping Lorenzo Medici will take his advice, so he'll get overthrown. Some people actually suggest this. I won't tell you what you should read the introduction. Your author has a very slick idea about what he thinks he's doing. On the other hand, maybe he is just appealing to someone the way that, because I mentioned Machiavelli sees himself as a professional, right? Maybe he's exaggerating for effect, right? Like I'm a professional politician. I'm a professional, whatever politico. I can do something for your state. I'm willing to do the dirty work. Wink, wink, right? Maybe I say this, by the way, just to give you some context. Machiavelli, of course, is definitely a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. His other major work on politics is called The Discourses on Livy. Livy is the ancient Roman historian who was a critic of Augustus, the emperor, who favored Republican institutions. And it's his book about how to, he's talking about, Republican theory. He's definitely a Republican. He doesn't like princes. And yet in that book, he doesn't say anything like this. He never says a good Republican will go out and kill people and stuff like this. So it's a real, and by the way, Machiavelli is a master of language. He's very slick. Very slick. That's why people aren't sure what he's, again, this wasn't written for public consumption either. What is he actually getting at here? What does he mean? And don't be taken in, by the way. Don't read things too literally. He's shifty. He's kind of sly as a thinker. And you notice here, by the way, I'll wrap this up here. There's nothing about women in this book. I couldn't fit that round hole in that square peg, or square peg into that round hole. I'll leave you with this. Fortuna, by the way, has traditionally been depicted as a woman. Why? Because women are supposed to be fickle. Although, to be fair, he describes everybody as being fickle, by the way, in his book. There is one very, he doesn't mention women at all in this, except for as a metaphor when he talks about how to deal with fortune, because fortune's a woman. That metaphor is very striking for Machiavelli. I'll put it that way, so you read this. But in him, by the way, you get to see both the progressive aspects in some ways of the Renaissance, but also its regressive, in some ways, darker aspects of the Renaissance. And the book, by the way, ends with his, this is the later parts we'll probably add it on later, where he's calling for Italians to unite and drive out the barbarians, the foreign invaders from Italy. That's also in the back of his mind. So keep that in mind. He's right in the middle of what might be construed as a state of emergency. Maybe that makes an effect on judging his book, morally speaking. So that is the end of the video. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I hope I get something out of the book. I'll see you guys when you come back, and hope we'll have a good discussion on Machiavelli. So I will see you guys later.